Hello, everyone, and welcome to the InCust Review, What Great Schools Do. This podcast is designed to inform educators, policymakers, and school communities about the research-based practices, policies, and procedures that make great urban schools, well, simply put, great. I'm your host, Dr. Deborah McLaren, Executive Coach for InCust. Today, our guest is Tavga Bustani. Welcome, Tavga.
Thank you.
So the first question we always ask is, our listeners would like to know a little bit about you and your role in education.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I bring personally over 24 years of educational experience across the UT K-12 grade setting. I have served in a variety of capacities, obviously as a classroom teacher, where I served underserved communities and students that have been historically marginalized. And I knew the impact of students in the classroom and the power and the influence of effective teaching that has on their lives. And I had the highest of expectations for children and held them to the highest level of what I believe academic excellence, which led to all of my children exceeding grade level standards. And I did that repeatedly for 3 years as a classroom teacher. And that's when I knew that it could be possible, that the power of effective teaching in the classroom can transform the lives of children. So from there, I pursued an administrative credential. I became a vice principal, peer coach, and most notably, principal at Edison Elementary. And that's where I met Dr. Joe Johnson, and he and I forged a partnership, and we had dramatic gains in student achievement by implementing the research-based strategies, structures, processes that we know work for children to achieve at high levels. And from that success, I was asked to join the district team at San Diego Unified to be a mentor principal, coaching other principals and implementing such structures that we know works, that research has proven can be effective. And so I worked alongside principals. We designed systems, professional development, put in structures, developed their leadership to be instructional leaders and to see outcomes change for children. From that, I became an instructional support officer where I led district teams to support schools on a large scale. And I then became the chief of leadership and learning, where I worked with the assistant superintendents, coaching and supporting them, and putting in system-wide what we know works and best practices we've seen to be effective. And the schools that InCust has studied, the principals that we've examined, the classrooms that we've visited, have proven that success is possible and equity and excellence is attainable if we implement what research says works.
You know, I want to go back a little bit because your journey started as a teacher, first and foremost, who wanted excellence for your students, and you believed not only in them, but you believed they deserved that. And I think that's what's really important for our listeners to remember is that it starts with us believing in our students when we are in the education arena to begin with. And you did that. Now, you talked a little bit about excellence and you talked a little bit about equity. When you think about equity and excellence, what comes to your mind first and foremost regarding not only your role, but also the greater need that you see that's out there?
It's interesting because we use the term equity, in my opinion, very loosely. And it's taken on many different connotations, different shades of understanding, and different levels of interpretation. For me, what I believe equity excellence means is that every single child is born with inherent brilliance and worth and has the capacity to surpass our expectations when we provide optimal learning conditions, when we ensure they have access to rigorous, challenging lessons that are standards-based, when teachers believe that they can succeed and set the expectation high, provide support, and ensure that every child leaves that classroom prepared with the skills and the dispositions needed to be successful in that school and in beyond and in life. That's at the core of equity and excellence to me. Equity is that every child absolutely deserves, regardless of zip code, background, language, experience, deserves the very best, and every family deserves the very best. And they are absolutely capable when given those situations and placed in conditions that nourish their brilliance and that value their lived experiences. And I believe it is possible because I am the oldest of 5 children of an immigrant family. I lived in poverty. My family came here as immigrants. We escaped the mountains of Iraq. I lived in a tent for 2 years as a child.
Oh my goodness.
We traveled by foot, and we were refugees, and we found a refuge in Iran for 2 years, living in a tent. Finally, we were sponsored by a family here in Maryland, I should say, in the East Coast. And my family, my father, we lived through poverty, but he worked his way out of it, and he wanted a better life for his children. But I know firsthand what it feels like, what it means to be a student, where language could have been a barrier. My background economically could have been a barrier. There were factors that worked against me. But with a family that believed, and in situations where teachers believed, and placed in environments where I was given those opportunities, I know that it can be done, and children can succeed.
You know, what I'm thinking as I'm hearing your story is the importance of our listeners having hope, knowing that it's possible for them, knowing it's possible for your children, knowing it's possible no matter what the barriers. Now, that doesn't mean we don't do things to remove those barriers. It just means the barriers don't prevent us from having the access and opportunities that we all deserve when we come to school for a quality education. And so I want to thank you for sharing that story, because that was inspiring to me, and I didn't know that story about you. Having been influenced by the events and experiences in your own life, what do you think it is that causes people to not want to fight for excellence and equity for all children? What do you think gets in the way?
That's a very good question, and I can just speak based on experience.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that there's an element of fear and not knowing how to. So that the knowing and the doing gap. Like, we know what works. We can read it. We can study it. There are books that have been published about schools and leaders that are transforming the lives of children every day. There's a gap that exists between what we know and how to make that happen. And in between that gap lives fear of not knowing how, fear of failure, fear of being bold and making courageous decisions that stand up for children, that challenge bias, that challenge mindsets, that challenge prejudice, that challenge belief systems of adults that may not believe in each and every. So how to navigate all of those circumstances can be, in some cases that I've seen, challenging for leaders to really create that culture of transformation, because perhaps the adults have fear that A, it's simply not possible, and B, that they cannot achieve success.
As you say that, one of the things that I have come to understand through a lot of reading and studying about cultural proficiency and how to become more culturally proficient, especially as we work in the educational system. When you talk about fear, one of the things that comes out in the work of Randall Lindsay and some others around cultural proficiency is this fear of some folks feeling as if they're going to lose something by giving something to someone else. So if I provide a quality or a great education for you, somehow that's going to hurt me in the long run if there perhaps aren't as many jobs, or I'm not the only person in line for the job because I have the education for it or whatnot. Instead of thinking of it as we're in this together, how do we support one another? I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about fear, because fear is a very powerful force. And when people are afraid they're going to lose something by you gaining something, that can lead to really just not good results for our schools and not great results for our community, but actually can be very destructive. So thank you for that. You also talked about equity, and you talked about the different connotations and the different definitions that people have, or understandings or interpretations, or however you want to call it. But I know that one of the concerns that I had when I was Director of Leadership Development, Equity, and Access was people had this misconception about equity. It was if they had this thought that if we promoted equity, we were saying we had to believe everything everybody believes and do whatever anybody else does and all of that. Can you speak a little bit more about those misconceptions of equity?
So what I've seen, equity taken in different means of interpretation. In some circumstances, equity, of course, means inclusion. But equity, in terms of inclusion, absent rigor, is an anomaly. So we believe all children can succeed, and we believe in diversity, and we believe in inclusion, and we believe in ensuring that every voice is heard. That is absolutely essential. If you don't have rigorous classroom experiences for children, where we provide high-quality teaching every single day, I can have a wonderful classroom that's inclusive and diverse, where children feel valued. Absent that academic press and the rigor, the two have to go hand in hand. And so often, they're seen as separate. So academics through and equity and academics go hand in hand, and often they're seen as separate. And we say that we are equitable because we attend to diversity, but our classroom practices don't reflect culturally responsive teaching practices. We say we are about inclusion. However, classroom practices don't always include the voices of those who really we need to hear from most. So there's a dichotomy and a contradiction if you really dig deep and sit in classrooms and observe what takes hold and interactions between adults to students, students to students, teaching practices, whose voice is heard the most, what type of experiences children are being exposed to, how does that differ from one school versus another. And to me, the rigor and the high expectations and the daily instruction that ensures every child is successful, you cannot have equity and excellence absent that.
I'm thinking here about the first sort of experience that I had to a greater degree of the term inclusion, and it was around the special education services that students were receiving and making sure that students had access to typically developing peers and being included in certain classes that they were developing their social skills or developing vocabulary, whatever it was. But this term inclusion was to make sure that we were mainstreaming or that we were including the students. However, what I noticed when I would go into the general ed classrooms where these students were being mainstreamed is many times mainstreaming just meant they sat there at the back of the room and then they were never called on to be a part of the class, to actually participate in the class. actually hear their voices or practice speaking with another student in the classroom. Mainstreaming just meant sit in the classroom, and now we've accounted for the fact that you are in this room. I feel that what you're saying about the academic rigor is very similar, that just because you're included, just because you're in the group and on the carpet, doesn't mean you're being called on, doesn't mean you're being heard, doesn't mean you are having the opportunity to actively participate in the lesson and develop your ability to interact and be a part of that experience in the class. So I appreciate your furthering that understanding for us.
Well, and another example is a recent walkthrough that I had in a classroom where the teacher is very passionate about her craft, loves her students, and is known to be a very strong, culturally proficient teacher. And when I'm in the classroom, I actually see evidence of that, where every child she checks for understanding. She is strategic about who she calls upon. She knows the needs of every child and places them strategically in partnerships where voices are heard and ideas are valued and children have opportunities to speak and share opinions. She has structures in place for children to express and give feedback around lessons that went well or didn't go well. So there are promising practices of teachers that actually have equity and excellence each and every day through what they do. So that's another example.
Yeah, I know that from my experience too. I know that to kind of sort of go off of that thinking about equity, I know that you're doing some work around when Black students excel. Can you talk a little bit about this book that has been recently published and is out there for our listeners by INCUS, but mainly the founding father, Dr. Johnson, headed up that book, and I know there were a couple of other authors on that book. Dr. Stanley Monroe was also an author on that. Can you talk a little bit about when Black students excel? What do you notice? What did you learn? What are the stories that are told in this book to give our listeners an understanding of it is possible, it does happen?
So I am very fortunate to actually lead a book study, an asynchronous book study on when Black students excel. And that's afforded me the opportunity to dive deep in each of these schools that have been identified by NCUST, where Black students outperform every single subgroup in their district and in most cases in the state. So not only are Black students excelling in their school compared to the state average, they're outperforming other student subgroups. Outstanding results. And the leaders at these schools that we've studied have characteristics that have created a positive culture where they believe and value every child, and they believe and value in every adult, and they've put in systems and structures that result in high levels of academic success. Paul Batalden had a quote that said, "Every system is designed to get the results that it gets."
Yes.
In these schools, there are systems and structures in place that work coherently and in an integrated way toward a common goal. So some of the characteristics from these principles is, number one, they are bold, they are audacious, and they're very vocal about their beliefs, and they make it known. They believe, and they will push back when they hear language or when encountered with situations that go against their core values and their beliefs. So they create a positive culture that ensures that every adult in that building believes in the capabilities and the brilliance of every child. So that's number one, is creating that culture with belief, expectation, and they put in structures where students are valued, are seen, are heard, and have an opportunity to shape the experience of that school. Another characteristic that these schools have in terms of leadership is that they are clear with the outcomes and the goals and what they expect to see in classrooms. And they don't shy away from conversations, from expectations. They provide high levels of support by providing quality professional development, providing time for teachers to collaborate, visiting classrooms, giving feedback. So systems are in place to allow teachers to plan, collaborate, determine what rigor means, deconstruct the standards, plan for the essential concepts that children need. There's clarity around what do children need each and every grade level and how they're going to monitor progress.
You know, the other thing I would add to that is that there's clarity about what we need to do first. There's clarity about keeping the main thing the main thing. And that was one of the things that I would focus on with the staffs that I worked with was, what do we do first? You have to understand what the priorities are. And when you're not clear as the leader about the priorities, about what we're going to tackle first, what needs to be addressed first, then it's very hard for you to run an organization, especially a school, when you're not clear. That clarity of purpose is not there. So I thank you for that.
I think, Claire, that you said what you said in the schools that we've studied and when Black students excel are cognizant and aware of the initiative overload that we experience in our typical schools, where you have just initiative on top of initiative, and there isn't clarity regarding what are we focusing on, what we know, the high leverage practices that are going to get outcomes. And so you should be able to ask, as Dr. Johnson coached me, and I've put it, a lot of the research-based practices that he's coached me on, I'm now supporting principals and implementing those. And I'll never forget, we have to be crystal clear. If I were to walk and approach any teacher in your building and ask them, what are you working on? What are the instructional practices you're working on to ensure that children are succeeding at the school? It should roll off their tongue. It should be concrete, crystal clear, apparent to everyone. And so often in the schools that are endeavoring to achieve equity and excellence, there is a reaction to address issues and gaps with initiatives. And, if we do this program and if we buy this resource, and there's a lack of coherence and alignment and clarity, like you said, around a common goal. And that's what makes these schools successful.
I think it also goes back to what you were talking about earlier with fear. For some leaders, and we know there are even books out there called Courageous Leadership. For some leaders, they're afraid to say no to some of these initiatives when they know that it's not the best thing for them to be focusing on at their school site. And that is part of the dilemma that we face as leaders. I'll never forget when I had the opportunity to open a brand new school. The focus of a brand new school is very different from the focus of a school that's established. First of all, you have students that are coming from all different schools, and some of them are grieving, leaving their friends and their teachers and their communities. You have a staff that have not worked together yet, so you have all of these relationships to develop and build and get to know who works well with whom and what their strengths are. You have a lot more building the culture, building the unity on that campus to focus on in the beginning, relationships, before you can take on all these initiatives. And I'll never forget, there was a person at, I think the person was my ed director, and we were talking about the GER model, the gradual release of responsibility. And she turned and she looked at me and she said, "So, Deborah, what is your school doing? Where are you on the continuum for the GER model?" And I said, "We're not doing that right now." I said, "We're just simply trying to get to know one another, figure out where we are, get to know our students, get to know their families. We had to focus on that first before we could do all of these initiatives that were coming down the pike. And oddly enough, my focus and my clarity on that purpose caused us in our first year opening the school, against all odds, in my opinion, all odds, we still were over the state benchmark in our first year and did quite well. And I was shocked by that, because we also were throwing substitutes in classrooms to start a new class every other month. And there were so many barriers, or so many obstacles, I should say. But in spite of that, the focus was clear. You know, and the other thing I've realized over time is that without a vision, the people perish. It's very important for the leader to have a clear vision, to be able to see clearly. Tavga, I want to thank you today for being a guest on our podcast. The National Center for Urban Schools Transformation was founded in 2005 to help districts and their partners transform schools into places where all students achieve academic proficiency, evidence of a love of learning, and graduate well prepared to succeed in post-secondary education, the workplace, and their communities. We will broadcast a new episode of this podcast at the beginning of each month. You can subscribe to the NCUST Review, What Great Schools Do, on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, and iHeartRadio. We want to thank you for listening to this episode of the NCUST Review. Until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Deborah McLaren, for the NCUST Review, What Great Schools Do.